text for this morning is Job chapter 22. Job chapter 10, excuse me. We'll be reading verses 1 to 22. Job chapter 10, verses 1 to 22. That's on page 520. You have the Geneva Bible. We've been looking at the first round of Job's friends trying to correct his so-called error. We've heard from Eliphaz, and we've heard from Bildad, and now we've heard from Zophar. And here in chapters 9 and 10, Job has been answering the accusations of Bildad. And last week we looked at chapter 9, and this week we'll look at chapter 10, where Job defends himself. Job chapter 10, verses 1 to 22. Verse 1. My soul is cut off, though I live. I will leave my complaint upon myself, and will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say unto God, condemn me not. Show me wherefore thou contendest with me. Thinkest thou it good to oppress me, and to cast off the labor of thine hands, and to favor the counsel of the wicked? Hast thou carnal eyes, or dost thou see as man seeth? Are thy days as man's days, or thy years as the time of man, that thou inquirest of mine iniquity, and searchest out my sin? Thou knowest that I cannot do wickedly, for none can deliver me out of thine hand. Thine hands have made me, fashioned me, wholly round about. And wilt thou destroy me? Remember, I pray thee, that thou hast made me as the clay, and wilt thou bring me into dust again? Hast thou not poured me out as milk, and turned me to curds like cheese? Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and joined me together with bones and sinews. Thou hast given me life and grace, and the visitation hath preserved my spirit. Though thou hast hid these things in thine heart, yet I know that it is so with thee. If I have sinned, then thou wilt straightly look unto me, and wilt not hold me guiltless of mine iniquity. If I have done wickedly, woe unto me. If I have done righteously, I will not lift up mine head, being full of confusion, because I see mine affliction. But let it increase. Hunt thou me as a lion. Return and show thyself marvelous upon me. Thou renewest thy plagues against me, and thou increasest thy wrath against me. Changes and armies of sorrow are against me. Wherefore then hast thou brought me out of the womb? Oh, that I had perished, and that none eye had seen me. And that I were as I had not been, but brought from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? Let him cease, and leave off from me, that I may take a little comfort. Before I go, and shall not return even to the land of darkness and shadow of death. Into a land, I say, dark as darkness itself, and into the shadow of death, where is none order, but the light is there as darkness. The title of our message this morning, Job chapter 10, verses 1 to 22, Job's response to Bildad, part 2, as we looked at his first response to Bildad in chapter 9. Our introduction. Here in this chapter, we have the second part of Job's defense against Bildad. So far, the book of Job has sought to answer two questions. First, why do we suffer? And second, is there a fixed moral order? The retribution principle. Are we always punished for evil, always rewarded for good? We, the reader, have learned that sometimes suffering comes as a punishment for sin. Sometimes it comes as a warning against future sins. And sometimes for no reason at all, as is the case of Job. Secondly, there is a moral order designed and controlled by God. But in human terms, wickedness does not always suffer. And innocence at times may appear to suffer. And we must at times practice, like Job, extreme patience and trust that God's unknowable will is always for our profit. There are 3 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 7, Job gives possible motivations for God's treatment of himself, trying to understand why God is treating him as such. Verses 8 to 17, the contradiction between the apparent and hidden purpose of God. And then verses 18 to 22, Job appeals to God to remove his oppressive presence. Now, I know when we read these words, they seem very blasphemous. The words of Job here are poetic. The rules of poetry allow for a wider range of emotion than does prose, which is more accurate. The poet often speaks how he feels, not as things are. He speaks from his emotion, not from his reason. The poet knows that his mind's thoughts are wrong, yet he speaks his fragile mind. In this text, Job gives voice to his thoughts and attempts to explore the infinite mind of God. But the infinite mind of God cannot be understood by finite man. Therefore, Job's words fall far short of understanding and accurately portraying the mind of God. We should come to our first point. Verses 1 to 7, Job lists possible motivations for God's treatment of Job, of himself. Verse 1, Job says this, "My soul is cut off, though I live. I will leave my complaint upon myself and will speak in the bitterness of my soul." Job here begins with a passionate resolution to persist in his complaining. That's what he's been doing so far. Job is overwhelmed with the dread of God's majesty. Since he could not plead his case with God, which he tried to do in the former chapters, he says he is now resolved to complain. And he begins with very violent language. He says, "My soul is cut off, though I live." Job is weary of God's correction, and he is as one buried alive. He will complain, he says, but he will leave his complaint upon himself, meaning he is willing to suffer the consequences of his rash words. He knows what he's saying is wrong. He also will speak, but it will be in the bitterness of his soul that he will express it, he says, not in his settled judgment. Job says that if he speaks wrongly of God, it is not him, but sin that dwells in him. It is not his soul speaking, but the bitterness of his soul speaking. He says he will not use his reason to watch his words, but he will speak freely, without any restraint of the mind. Verse 2, Job says, "I will say unto God, condemn me not. Show me wherefore thou contendest with me." Job has warned God in verse 1 that he is about to speak harshly from the bitterness of his soul. He comes right to the problem. And he asks God, "Why do you cause me to suffer?" Or, "Why do you persecute me?" Or as the text says, "Contend with me." Now, when God afflicts us, he contends with us. And when he contends with us, there's always a reason. He is never angry at us without a cause, though we are angry without a cause. And we should wish to know what the reason is he is angry with us when things aren't going well, that we may repent of, mortify, and forsake the sins for which God has a controversy with us. Job asks, "What is my sin that you treat me so badly?" Verse 3, Job says, "Thinkest thou it good to oppress me, and to cast off the labor of thine hands, and to favor the counsel of the wicked?" God, of course, remains silent to Job's question here. Therefore, Job decides to speculate out loud what might be the reasons for God's motivation to punish Job to this severity for so long. So his first question here asks God, "Do you, God, gain something by treating me this way?" He says, "What profit is there in the oppression of me?" Job wonders aloud, why did God make him? Was it to take some kind of perverse pleasure in his suffering? What might God hope to gain by oppressing his creation? Job asks. A creation that God made in his own image. And if there is some gain in oppressing mankind, why not oppress the wicked rather than the one who has served him loyally? It seems contrary to Job that God's very nature to Job to reward the wicked and punish the good. Job cannot reconcile God's providence with God's justice. Verse 4, he asks a second disrespectful, blasphemous question of God. Hast thou carnal eyes, or dost thou see as man seest? The second question asks if God sees as a man sees. Job reasons that for God to treat a righteous man as if he were guilty suggests that God must have some defect in his vision. Job thinks it unbecoming the infinite knowledge of God to judge man as man judges man. And let's look at the differences in the way God judges and man judges or sees. For instance, man looks only on the appearance but can never fully understand. But God sees the heart and always fully understands. Man cannot see in the dark or what is hidden from his eyes, but darkness cannot hide from the eyes of God. The eyes of man can be in one place at a time, but God sees all. Nothing is hidden from the sight of God. His sight cannot be deceived, for God knows the heart, and is a witness to the thoughts and intents of all men. Eyes of man or eyes of flesh discover things gradually. And when we gain the sight of one thing or understand one thing, we forget another and lose the sight of another. But God sees everything, always at one time in perfect view. Never forget it. Eyes of flesh are soon tired and must be closed every night. But God's eyes neither slumber nor sleep, nor does his sight ever decay, like the sight of man. God does not see as man sees, and therefore he does not judge as man judges. Man judges by what appears to be true, and it's too often based on biases and unlawful affections and passions and prejudice and self-interest. But God knows truth always and never by second-hand information like we learn it, but by his own perfect inspection. Men discover secret things by research and examination of witnesses, comparing evidence and making educated guesses. But God does not need any of these ways to discover the truth. He does not see as man sees. If this is all true, as Job suspects that it is, and as we know that it is, Job wonders then how can the puzzle of God's behavior be explained? Why does God's treatment of Job seem like the faulty work of men, like the way a foolish man would judge, and not the way an infinite God would judge? Verses 5 and 6. Are thy days as man's days, or thy years as the time of man? That thou inquirest of mine iniquity, and searchest out my sin? Here we have the third question Job asks of God, and it is whether God is under the same kind of pressure like man is. Job reasons that man's days are short. Therefore, man must make plans and rush to accomplish all his plans in a lifetime. Because man's life is short, his goals are short-sighted. But it is not so with God. To him, nothing is past, nothing is future, but everything is always in the present. The days of time by which the life of man is measured are nothing to the years of eternity in which the life of God exists. Job therefore thinks it strange that God should sift him to such a degree, prolonging his torture, neither telling Job what his sin is, nor granting him a release from what his sin is. Job asks, why must God so diligently inquirest after mine iniquity, and continually and diligently search after his sin? In other words, why must God punish Job so often and without restraint, if he will live for an eternity and Job's days are so short? Why must God be in such a rush to punish Job if he lives for an eternity? That's the third question Job asks. Verse 7, thou knowest that I cannot do wickedly, for none can deliver me out of thine hand. Job was upset that God's treatment of him made him appear guilty to the world, and especially to his three friends. This is especially troubling to Job because he sees himself as innocent of any major abuses or scandalous sin. Job says, as if to say, God knows that I am not wicked. Now, Job had already admitted that he was a sinner and guilty before God. But he states that he was not wicked, as are those who do not believe in God at all, nor make no attempt to please God. Nor is he wicked like the scandalous sinner. Nor is he wicked like the enemy of God. Nor has he done anything scandalous to offend God, which is all true. He is blameless. He has sinned, but he hasn't sinned in any kind of major degree. But since none can deliver me out of thine hand, says Job, then there is no remedy. Job must be content to lie there, patiently waiting for a reversal of his fortune, and throw himself on the mercy of God, in submission to God's sovereign will, a will he doesn't understand. In these three questions here, Job has suggested that God might not see properly, or that God might have overlooked his case, or that God might be so pressed for time that he has acted callously in his punishment of Job. But Job concludes here in verse 7 by declaring that God knows that he is innocent of any crime worthy of this severity of punishment. We come to our second point, verses 8 through 17, the contradiction between the apparent and hidden purpose of God. Verse 8, Job says this, Thine hands have made me and fashioned me wholly round about, and wilt thou destroy me? In verses 8 through 17 here, Job seeks to show the contradiction between the apparent and hidden purposes of God. He begins here in verses 8 to 12 to show God's grace to man and his greatest glory, which was the creation of man. He notes here that God has made us, not our parents, who were only providential instruments of his power. Since God's handiwork in the creation of man was so glorious, Job wonders why God would so easily destroy it or mar it, as is in the case of Job's life. Job says here in verse 9, Remember, I pray thee, that thou hast made me as the clay, and wilt thou bring me into dust again? Job here asks God to remember. Of course, it's impossible for God not to remember. But he asks God to remember, in case he forgets, that the conception and formation of mankind in the womb is the personal activity of God the Creator. Job is trying here to create a tension between God's former tender concern of Job when he was born and in his early life, and his current destructive behavior towards Job now. Job cannot reconcile the difference between God's marvelous creation of Job, along with his past love and concern for his care, and the way that God now appears to have forsaken him and shown him nothing but hatred. Job errs in believing that God takes any pleasure in this trying of his elect. For God only takes pleasure in the sanctifying results of trying his elect. But Job here is, of course, too bitter to reconcile the two. He can't understand that ultimately this is for his good. Verses 10 and 11. Hast thou not poured me out as milk, and turned me to curds like cheese? Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and joined me together with bones and sinews. Here, Job describes God's elegant creation of man in the womb by using an example. God took the basest of materials, clay or dirt, and formed man. And in this particular example, God poured out milk and turned it into cheese. Man begins in the womb, the smallest of cells, but soon he is given skin and flesh, bone and cartilage, heart and lungs. So Job praises God's wonderful creation. Verse 12, Thou hast given me life and grace, and thy visitation hath preserved my spirit. Goes on to say, but God did not only stop with the physical, outward parts in the creation of man, as he did with the animals. God went beyond just the physical life with man, but also gave man a spiritual life. Man is God's highest creation because he was given a soul and made in the image of God in knowledge, righteousness, and holiness. The soul that is within us is our life. The soul is the life. The soul is the man. And this is the gift of God. Since God has made Job, ought he not also to preserve him? Job asks. Should not God be more loyal and attentive to his own glorious creation of man? And this is where it turns. Verses 13 and 14. Though thou hast hid these things in thine heart, Job says, yet I know that it is so with thee. If I have sinned, then thou wilt straightly look unto me, and will not hold me guiltless of mine iniquity. Now Job's words quickly turn very ugly. We see now that he was merely buttering up God in verses 8 to 12 when he started to praise God's creation. For now he accuses God of merely pretending to tenderly love and care for his creation. When in reality this was all a facade, he says, or a false front. Remember, Job's speaking out of the bitterness of his soul. He's not holding back. Job says God's real purpose was not to love and care for his creation, but to diligently search to find fault with man. Behind God's smiling providence, according to Job, he hid a frowning face. Job here in these two verses accuses God of creating man and merely pretending to watch over him. In actuality, he said God was spying on man, searching diligently for some sin by which he could accuse man so that he could treat him cruelly. Job has acted righteously and innocently, but God, eager to be cruel, has found him guilty by exaggerating his smaller faults. Therefore, Job concludes, God's apparent holy purposes are in reality a hidden and cruel agenda. Job believes that God knows exactly what he's doing. Job wants to believe that God knows that he has not committed any sin worthy of such punishment. Yet God endures in his punishment. Every time that Job pleads his innocence, he feels as if he's punished worse. Job wonders what God's true intentions must be. For if God is not punishing some sin or reacting to some recent event, then it stands to reason that God had always planned to treat Job in this manner, regardless of whether he was loyal or wicked. Verse 15, Job says, if I have done wickedly, notice in 14 he said, if I have sinned. Now he says, if I have done wickedly, woe unto me. If I have done righteously, I will not lift up mine head, being full of confusion, because I see mine affliction. Job says that if he has done wickedly, then he is doomed in the world to come. He deserves it. And if he has been righteous, and if he defends his righteousness, it doesn't matter, because he's all the more afflicted anyway. Job feels that God has determined to afflict him whether he was righteous or not. Job thinks to himself that God might have treated him arbitrarily, not knowing what affliction he had caused against Job. But then he immediately dismisses this notion, for if God had forgotten him, then he would at least accidentally gain some relief. However, God executes an unhesitating design to destroy Job's life and reputation. God has been too consistently harsh to Job for him not to be doing this deliberately and not paying close attention. If Job is in fact a wrongdoer, he is destined for punishment. And if he is innocent, he has no assurance of his innocence because of the manner in which he is being treated by God and his three friends. 16 and 17, the end of this point, Job says, but let it increase. Hunt thou me as a lion, and show thyself marvelous upon me. Thou renewest thy plagues against me, and thou increasest thy wrath against me. Changes and armies of sorrow are against me. It says here that even if Job had the energy to assert himself by stubbornly maintaining his innocence, he realizes it would do him no good, because God hunts him as a lion. Job earlier praised God's marvelous work in creation, but now the word marvelous takes a sinister turn. Now God is marvelous in his unending pursuit of Job by plagues and wrath. Job's ailment, at least in the mind of Job, were tokens of God's displeasure, which it wasn't really. That's the way he took it. This made the sores of his body wounds in his spirit. God, according to Job, was at war with him. And Job had no idea what had caused this great and sudden change between he and God. Now we come to our final point, verses 18 through 22. Job appeals to God to remove his oppressive presence. Verses 18 and 19. Wherefore then hast thou brought me out of the womb? O that I had perished, and that none eye had seen me, and that I were as I had not been, but brought from the womb to the grave. Job feels that God created him only to watch him closely and to find him guilty of the smallest crime and take some sick pleasure in the punishment of that minor crime. Job sees himself as a righteous man who nevertheless finds himself in the hands of an angry God with no escape. Having reached this conclusion, Job returns to his previous thoughts of desiring death. He wonders aloud, if this was designed for my lot, this kind of life, why was I even brought out of the womb and not smothered there or stifled at birth? It may be that Job's friends have driven him to these mad words to overstate his case, but now Job moves from passively implying that God was responsible to here directly blaming God. Now his desire is not to exist. Now his desire to not exist is not to escape pain, but to have never, ever have been part of God's perverse divine plan, which was to find smaller faults and punish him without mercy. Job's anguish arises not from his calamity and suffering, as it did in chapter 3, but from the consciousness that has now developed in him that the suffering that he endures is no accident, but what appears to him the long-standing grisly design of God. Verse 20, Are not my days few? Let him cease and leave off from me, that I may take a little comfort. Job here offers his final lament. He says, Are not my remaining days few? So few that God can't find in his heart to give me a little peace, cheer, or comfort? Must God continue to act as his divine enemy, constantly brooding over him, relentlessly making his oppressive divine presence known to Job every second of the day? Can God not remove his grim presence for only a short time, asks Job. Since Job is soon to spend an eternity in death, can he not have a little comfort before he dies, that he might leave the world with some assurance that God will show him some mercy at death? Verses 21 to 22. Job says, Before I go and shall not return, even to the land of darkness and shadow of death, into a land, I say, dark as darkness itself, and into the shadows of death, where is none order, but the light is there as darkness. After all, says Job, I am soon to go to the grave, which for Job is no longer dwelling in the special presence of God, but a temporary escape from the oppressive presence of God. Job seems to talk specifically of the state of the body in death. The soul, of course, goes to either eternal bliss or punishment, but the body must lie in darkness until the second coming of Christ. Job says in the grave, speaking of the body being in the grave because the soul is not there, he says in the grave where the body must rest, there is no